The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel sat in the cramped hold of the American transport ship, his wrists no longer bound, but his pride completely shattered. It was May 1945, and the war that promised a 1,000-year Reich had ended in just 12 years of chaos and destruction. Beside him sat General Alfred Jodl, another high-ranking officer who had signed Germany's unconditional surrender just days ago. Neither man spoke much during the voyage. What was there to say? The ship rocked gently through the waves, carrying them toward an uncertain fate in America. Keitel remembered the last time he had crossed an ocean, back in 1936, when Germany hosted the Olympics and the world still saw them as a rising power. Now, they were prisoners, defeated and despised. The Americans who guarded them said little, their faces hard and professional. Keitel expected this coldness. After all, the Allies had liberated the concentration camps. They had seen the horrors. No German officer could expect mercy now. Below deck, rumors spread among the captured German officers like wildfire. Some whispered that Americans would execute them all upon arrival. Others claimed they would face trials and hangings. A few believed they would be sent to labor camps in Alaska, forced to work in frozen mines until they died. Keitel had heard all these stories, and honestly, he believed them. Why would the victors show kindness to those who had caused so much destruction? The war in Europe had killed tens of millions of people. Cities lay in ruins from London to Stalingrad. The Jewish people had suffered unimaginable genocide. Germany had sown the wind, and now would reap the whirlwind. Jodl finally broke the long silence between them. His voice was hoarse from lack of use. He asked Keitel if he remembered the grand banquets in Berlin, back when victory still seemed possible. Keitel nodded slowly. Yes, he remembered. Even in 1944, when the Eastern Front was collapsing and Allied bombers darkened the skies daily, the Nazi leadership still held elaborate dinners. They drank French wine stolen from occupied territories. They ate meat while German civilians received ration cards for bread. They pretended everything was fine while the Reich crumbled around them. But those banquets had grown smaller and sadder as the war progressed. By early 1945, even high-ranking officers like Keitel struggled to find decent food. The last meal he ate in Berlin before the surrender was watery potato soup and a small piece of dark bread that tasted like sawdust. The bread had green spots of mold that he carefully cut away before eating. That was what the mighty German military had been reduced to, starving its own leadership while millions of soldiers froze and starved on collapsing fronts. The American ship finally reached land after 8 days at sea. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks, still uncertain of their destination. Keitel peered through the canvas covering and saw countryside unlike anything he had seen during the war. Everything looked untouched by conflict. No bomb craters, no burned buildings, no starving refugees on the roads. Just green fields, fat cattle grazing peacefully, and farmhouses that stood intact and freshly painted. It seemed impossible that this nation had just fought a massive war across 2 oceans while its homeland remained completely unscathed. The trucks drove south for many hours through states with strange names that Keitel did not recognize. Tennessee, Alabama, finally Mississippi. The heat grew more intense with each passing mile. When they finally stopped, Keitel could barely breathe in the thick, humid air. He stepped down from the truck and found himself in front of a large camp surrounded by wire fences and guard towers. A sign read, Camp Clinton Prisoner of War Facility. So this was to be their prison. American military police escorted Keitel and Jodl through the camp gates. Keitel expected to see misery and suffering inside, but instead he saw something that confused him deeply. German prisoners walked freely within the compound, wearing clean uniforms with PW painted on the back. Some worked in vegetable gardens that looked healthy and well-maintained. Others played football in an open field, laughing and shouting to each other. A few sat in the shade reading books. They did not look like men being tortured or starved. They looked almost content. An American officer, a captain with a thick southern accent, led Keitel and Jodl to their quarters. The barracks were simple but clean, with real beds and thin mattresses. There were windows that actually opened to let in air. The walls were whitewashed and recently painted. Keitel had expected a dark cell with a dirt floor. Instead, he got a room that looked better than many German military barracks he had inspected during the war. The captain told them they would share these quarters and that they should follow camp rules. No trouble would be tolerated, but they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. After the captain left, Keitel sat on his bed and touched the clean sheets. He looked at Jodl, who seemed equally bewildered. This was not what either man had expected. Where was the revenge? Where was the brutality? They had prepared themselves mentally for beatings, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, they found clean quarters and German prisoners who looked healthier than German soldiers had looked in years. As the sun began to set outside their window, a young American corporal appeared at their door. He spoke a few words of broken German, clearly trying to be polite despite the language barrier. He informed them that dinner would be served at 6 o'clock in about 20 minutes. He pointed toward the mess hall and then left. Keitel and Jodl looked at each other. Dinner? On their first day, they had assumed they would be left hungry as punishment, at least for the first few days. Perhaps this was another American tactic, some psychological game to make them confused before the real punishment began. The two field marshals waited nervously, watching the clock on the wall tick towards 6. Neither man knew what to expect. Both men remembered the hunger of recent months, the desperate scrounging for food, the shame of important military officers reduced to begging for scraps. Whatever the Americans brought them, it could not be worse than what they had already endured, or so they thought. The sound of footsteps approached their quarters at exactly 6 o'clock. Keitel straightened his worn uniform jacket, a habit from years of military discipline. The door opened, and two young American soldiers entered, each carrying a metal tray covered with a cloth. They set the trays down on the small table between the two beds, nodded politely, and left without saying anything. The whole interaction lasted maybe 15 seconds. No insults, no spitting, no cruelty. Just two soldiers delivering food and leaving. Keitel stared at the covered trays. Jodl stood up from his bed and moved closer, equally curious and suspicious. What could be under those cloths? Scraps? Rotten vegetables? Bread and water? They had both heard stories during the war about how Allied prisoners in German camps were treated. The rations had been terrible, especially toward the end when Germany itself was starving. Surely the Americans would return that treatment with interest. With shaking hands, Keitel lifted the cloth from his tray. For a moment, he could not process what he was seeing. His brain simply refused to accept it. There, arranged neatly on the metal tray, was a complete meal that looked like something from a restaurant. A large piece of fried chicken, golden brown and crispy, took up most of the plate. Beside it sat a generous portion of mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy. Green beans, cooked with small pieces of bacon, filled another section. 2 slices of fresh white bread with a pat of butter. And in the corner, a slice of apple pie with a flaky crust. Keitel's voice came out as barely a whisper. He called to Jodl, asking him to look at his own tray. Jodl lifted his cloth and found exactly the same meal. The two men stood there, frozen, staring at food they had not seen in years. This was not prison food. This was not punishment rations. This was better than what German officers had eaten during the final year of the war. Better than the meals served at headquarters in Berlin. Better than anything Keitel had tasted since before the Allied invasion of France in 1944. Jodl suggested carefully that perhaps this was a special meal for their first day. Maybe tomorrow they would receive the real prison food, the starvation rations they expected. Or perhaps this was a trick, a way to make them grateful before showing them the true harshness of captivity. Keitel agreed. This seemed logical. No nation feeds its prisoners this well, especially not prisoners from a defeated enemy that had caused so much suffering. It made no sense, but the food was real. The chicken was still hot, steam rising from it in the humid Mississippi evening. The smell filled their small room, rich and savory. Keitel's stomach, which had learned to stay quiet through months of hunger, suddenly cramped with desperate need. He had not realized how hungry he was until this moment. His last real meal had been 3 days ago on the ship, a bowl of plain stew that was adequate but nothing special. They sat down at the small table, their movements cautious, almost reverent. Keitel picked up the fork provided and cut a small piece of the chicken. The crispy coating crunched under his fork. He lifted it to his mouth, still half expecting this to be some kind of elaborate dream or hallucination brought on by stress and hunger. But when he bit down, the taste exploded across his tongue. The chicken was perfectly seasoned, the meat juicy and tender beneath the crispy skin. It was real. It was delicious. It was impossible. Across the table, Jodl tried the mashed potatoes. His eyes went wide, and his hand froze halfway to his mouth for a second bite. The potatoes were creamy and smooth, mixed with real butter and cream. They practically melted on the tongue. He had forgotten food could taste like this. During the last months in Berlin, potatoes had been a luxury, and when they were available, they were usually half-rotten or mixed with sawdust to stretch the supply. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They simply ate, each bite revealing new flavors they had forgotten existed. The green beans actually tasted fresh, not like the canned vegetables they had eaten during the war. The bread was soft and white, nothing like the dense, dark bread made from substitute ingredients that had become standard in Germany. The butter was real butter, not margarine or some chemical substitute. Keitel finally broke the silence. His voice was thick with emotion he did not want to show. He said, very quietly, that this meal was better than the banquets they had attended as field marshals. The fancy dinners with Nazi leadership, the celebrations of victories that would soon turn to defeats, the elaborate meals that pretended everything was fine while the nation collapsed. None of those meals, with all their pretension and stolen luxury, had tasted as good as this simple American prison food. Jodl nodded slowly, unable to speak around the piece of bread in his mouth. He swallowed and admitted that he could not remember the last time he had eaten chicken this good. Perhaps before the war started, back in 1939, when Germany was still prosperous and food was abundant. But even then, he was not sure meals were this satisfying. There was something about the desperate hunger of recent months that made this food taste almost magical. They saved the apple pie for last, like children saving the best part of a meal. When Keitel finally tried it, he had to close his eyes. The apples were sweet and perfectly spiced with cinnamon. The crust was buttery and flaky. There was even a hint of vanilla in the filling. This was not just food. This was care. This was abundance. This was everything the Third Reich had promised its people but failed to deliver. After they finished eating, the two men sat in silence again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, fearful silence of the journey across the ocean. Not the anxious silence of waiting for punishment. This was the silence of confusion and unwanted understanding. Something was very wrong with their understanding of America. Or perhaps, something had been very wrong with their understanding of everything that a thought began to form in Keitel's mind. A thought he did not want to acknowledge but could not push away. If America could feed its prisoners this well, feed the men who had fought against them and lost, what did that say about American power? What did it say about the lies they had been told about American weakness and decadence? What did it say about the war they had just lost? The plate sat empty on the table between them. Outside their window, the Mississippi night filled with the sound of crickets and cicadas. Tomorrow they would eat again, and the day after that, and the day after that, and each meal would force them to face uncomfortable truths they had spent years avoiding. Morning came with the sound of a bugle playing reveille across Camp Clinton. Keitel woke with a start, momentarily confused about where he was. Then reality settled back over him like a heavy blanket. He was a prisoner of war in Mississippi. The war was over. Germany had lost. He sat up on his bed and saw that Jodl was already awake, staring at the ceiling with an expression of deep thought. Neither man had slept well. The meal from the previous evening had unsettled them more than any threat or punishment could have. It violated everything they thought they knew about captivity and defeat. Keitel had spent part of the night wondering if yesterday's dinner was indeed a one-time event, a gesture for their arrival that would not be repeated. Perhaps today they would receive the real prison food at T7 in the morning. The same two young American soldiers appeared with breakfast trays. Keitel braced himself for disappointment, for the reality he expected. But when the cloth came off, he found scrambled eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with jam, and a cup of real coffee. Not the substitute coffee made from acorns and chicory that Germans had learned to tolerate. Real coffee with cream and sugar available on the side. Jodl actually laughed when he saw the bacon. It was not a happy laugh, but a sound of complete disbelief. He picked up a strip and examined it as if it might be an illusion. Bacon. They were feeding prisoners bacon. In Germany, bacon had become something civilians only dreamed about by 1943. Even high-ranking officers struggled to get meat of any kind by 1945. And here, in an American prison camp, bacon appeared on breakfast trays like it was nothing special. The eggs were fluffy and properly cooked. The toast was made from soft white bread, still warm. The jam tasted like real strawberries. Keitel spread butter on his toast and noticed his hand was shaking slightly. This was their second meal in American captivity, and it was as good as the first. This was not a special occasion. This was apparently normal. Over the next week, the pattern continued. 3 meals arrived every single day, each one generous and varied. Lunch brought sandwiches with actual sliced meat, soup, fresh fruit, and milk. Real milk, cold and creamy, not the powdered substitute Germans had used for years. Dinner continued to surprise them, with different dishes each evening. Roast beef one night, pork chops another, baked fish on Friday, always with vegetables, bread, and dessert. Keitel began to notice something else too. He was gaining weight. His uniform, which had hung loosely on his frame when he arrived, now fit properly again. His face, which had been gaunt and hollow-cheeked, was filling out. He could see the same changes in Jodl. They were both starting to look healthy again, like officers should look, not like the half-starved scarecrows they had become in the final months of the war. The 2 field marshals were eventually allowed to interact with other German prisoners in the camp. During exercise periods in the yard, they met other captured officers, some from the Wehrmacht, others from the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. The conversations that followed were eye-opening and deeply disturbing. A Luftwaffe general named Stumpf told them he had gained 15 pounds in just 3 weeks. He patted his growing belly with a mixture of shame and wonder. He admitted he had not been this heavy since 1942 that a panzer commander, a colonel named Becker, told them an even more troubling story. He had been captured during the final battle for the Ruhr Pocket in April. His entire division had been surrounded and starving. Men were eating grass and tree bark. Some had resorted to eating their leather belts just to have something in their stomachs. When the Americans finally captured them, Becker expected to be shot or left to starve as punishment. Instead, American medics treated the wounded, and every prisoner received hot food within hours. Becker said he actually cried after his first American meal because he thought about all the men in his command who had died of starvation just days before adequate food arrived. The stories piled up, each one adding to Keitel's growing sense of confusion and guilt. Every German officer had a similar tale. The Americans fed them well, treated their wounds, gave them clean clothes and bedding, and asked only that they follow camp rules. Some prisoners even received packages from the Red Cross with chocolate, cigarettes, and other luxuries. There was a library where German prisoners could check out books. A small infirmary where real doctors provided medical care, not the battlefield medicine that left men crippled or dead. There was even talk of some prisoners being allowed to work outside the camp on local farms, earning small wages. Keitel started keeping a secret diary, writing his thoughts in small handwriting on paper he obtained from the camp administration. He wrote about the strange guilt that ate at him every evening when dinner arrived. He had been a field marshal, one of the highest-ranking officers in the German military. He had dined with Hitler. He had made decisions that affected millions of soldiers. And all that time, while he enjoyed whatever privileges Berlin could still provide, ordinary German soldiers were starving in trenches and forests across Europe. His own troops had frozen to death in Russia while waiting for supplies that never came. They had fought on empty stomachs while he sat in heated offices eating whatever food could be scrounged. And even those scrounged meals, those desperate attempts at maintaining officer privileges, were nothing compared to what he ate now as a prisoner of the nation he had fought against. The irony was so bitter it made him feel physically ill sometimes. Jodl grew increasingly quiet as the days passed. He spent long hours staring at his dinner tray before eating, as if the food offended him somehow. One evening, about 2 weeks into their captivity, he finally spoke the thought that had been growing in both their minds. He said to Keitel that they had fought for a regime that could not even feed its own army properly, while the nation they called soft and weak and decadent fed even its captured enemies with abundance and variety. Keitel did not respond right away. What could he say? Jodl was right. The evidence sat on their dinner trays every evening. Germany had promised strength and power and greatness, but it could not keep its people fed. America, which Nazi propaganda had always portrayed as a weak nation of spoiled civilians who would collapse under pressure, had just won a war on 2 fronts while maintaining such abundance at home that it could afford to feed hundreds of thousands of prisoners better than Germany fed its own officers. That night, Keitel wrote in his diary about the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of the German war effort. They had looked at American culture and seen softness. They had looked at American democracy and seen weakness. They had looked at American abundance and called it decadence. But they had completely failed to understand that abundance was itself a form of strength, perhaps the ultimate form of strength. A nation that could produce so much food, so many weapons, so many supplies that it had surplus even for its enemies, was a nation that could never be defeated by a country struggling to feed its own population. The invitation came as a surprise. Colonel Robert Harrison, the American commander of Camp Clinton, requested the presence of Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl for dinner in his office. The message was polite but formal, making it clear this was not optional. The 2 German officers dressed in their cleanest uniforms and reported to the administration building at the appointed time, both nervous about what this meeting might mean. Colonel Harrison's office was simple and functional, with maps of Europe on the walls and a large American flag in the corner. The colonel himself was a man in his late 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he had seen too much of war. He gestured for them to sit at a small table that had been set for 3 people. Dinner was already waiting, the same food the other prisoners received but served on slightly nicer plates. Roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Harrison spoke decent German, having studied it before the war. He explained that he occasionally dined with senior German officers to discuss military logistics and gather intelligence about the war. Nothing they said would be used against them in trials, he promised, but understanding German military thinking helped the Americans plan for occupation and rebuilding. It was all very professional and businesslike. They ate in relative silence for the first few minutes, making awkward small talk about the weather and camp conditions. But Keitel could not contain his confusion any longer. The question that had been burning inside him for weeks finally burst out. He asked Colonel Harrison directly why they were being fed so well. Why were prisoners receiving meals that were better than what German officers ate during the war? Why this abundance when punishment and revenge would make more sense? Harrison looked genuinely surprised by the question. He set down his fork and thought for a moment before answering. He explained that the Geneva Convention required proper treatment of prisoners of war. All nations that signed the treaty agreed to provide adequate food, shelter, and medical care to captured enemy soldiers. America took these obligations seriously, he said, because American soldiers had also been captured and were held in German and Japanese camps. If America wanted its own men treated well, it had to treat enemy prisoners well in return. But then Harrison added something that made both German officers sit up straighter. He said that beyond legal obligations, feeding prisoners properly was simply not difficult for America. The United States produced more food than its population could consume. American farms were so productive, so mechanized, and so vast that surplus was a constant problem, not scarcity. During the war, America had fed its own military, sent massive amounts of food to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease programs, maintained normal civilian rations at home, and still had enough left over to feed prisoners. The cost of providing good meals to prisoners was negligible in the larger military budget, Jodl asked a careful question about whether this was propaganda, whether Harrison was exaggerating American abundance to demoralize them. Harrison actually laughed at that. He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder of papers and photographs. He showed them reports on American agricultural production, statistics about wheat harvests in Kansas, corn from Iowa, beef from Texas, dairy from Wisconsin. The numbers were staggering. America produced enough food to feed several times its own population. Harrison then mentioned something that shocked both German officers even more. He said that German prisoners of war were actually working on American farms throughout the country. Thousands of them. They helped harvest crops, milk cows, plant fields, and maintain agricultural operations. They were paid small wages for this work, treated fairly, and learned modern farming techniques. Some prisoners, he said quietly, had already submitted requests to immigrate to America after the war ended. They did not want to return to the destroyed landscape of Germany. They wanted to stay in this land of abundance. Keitel felt something break inside him at those words. German soldiers, men who had fought for the fatherland and the promises of the Reich, now wanted to abandon Germany and stay with the former enemy. It was the ultimate defeat, more crushing than any military loss. These men had seen American prosperity firsthand and realized that everything they had been told was a lie. Jodl asked another question, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to know if American soldiers ate even better than the prisoners. Harrison shrugged and said army food was pretty similar to what the prisoners received, maybe slightly better in some units. But then he added that American civilians back home, the ordinary people not involved in war production, ate even better than soldiers or prisoners. They had access to restaurants, grocery stores full of fresh produce and meat, bakeries, and all the variety that civilian life provided. The average American factory worker ate better than most German officers had eaten during the entire war. That statement hung in the air like smoke. Harrison seemed to realize he had said something profound, because he stopped eating and looked at the two German officers with something like sympathy in his eyes. He said he understood this must be difficult to process, but it explained much about the war's outcome. The Allies, and especially America, had simply outproduced Germany in every category. Food, weapons, ammunition, vehicles, ships, aircraft, everything. The German military had fought with skill and courage, he acknowledged, but courage cannot defeat a nation that produces 10 tanks for every one tank you build, 10 aircraft for every one you assemble, 10 bullets for every one you manufacture. The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. Harrison tried to lighten the mood with stories about Mississippi and his plans to return to his farm after the war ended, but neither Keitel nor Jodl could engage with the conversation. Their minds were spinning with implications they could not escape. When the dinner ended and they were escorted back to their quarters, the two men walked slowly through the camp. Around them, German prisoners laughed and talked, some playing cards, others reading under electric lights. The camp felt almost peaceful, nothing like the desperate atmosphere of the collapsing Reich. In the distance, they could hear music playing on a radio, some American song with a happy melody. Keitel finally spoke, his voice heavy with realization. He told Jodl that they had lost the war before it even began. Germany had attacked a nation with resources beyond their comprehension, industrial capacity they could never match, and agricultural abundance that made German food production look medieval by comparison. They had believed their own propaganda about American weakness, and that belief had doomed millions of people. Jodl agreed quietly, adding that the food on their plates every evening was proof of German failure. Every good meal was evidence of American superiority in the most basic human need. Every full stomach reminded them that German promises of strength and power had been empty lies. A nation that could not feed its army, could not keep its people from starving, could not maintain basic supplies even for its leadership, had no business starting a world war. They reached their quarters and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow 3 more excellent meals would arrive, and each one would taste more bitter than the last. Summer turned to autumn at Camp Clinton. The Mississippi heat gradually softened into more comfortable temperatures, and the leaves on the trees around the camp began to change color. Keitel marked each passing week in his secret diary, noting the meals, the conversations, and the slow transformation he observed in himself and the other prisoners. 3 months had passed since his arrival, and in that time, everything he thought he understood about power and strength had been turned upside down. The changes in the camp were visible everywhere. Prisoners who had arrived thin and haunted now had color in their faces and strength in their movements. Men who could barely walk when they first came could now play football for hours without tiring. The camp doctor, an American captain named Williams, conducted regular health checks and reported that most prisoners had gained between 15 and 30 pounds since arrival. Malnutrition, which had been almost universal among captured German soldiers, was now rare in the camp. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to the mental and emotional changes. Keitel watched as younger prisoners began to smile and joke again, their spirits recovering along with their bodies. Some learned English from their guards and practiced it enthusiastically. Others took advantage of educational programs offered by the Red Cross, studying mathematics, literature, and practical skills. A few prisoners formed a band and gave concerts on weekend evenings, playing American jazz and swing music they had once been told was degenerate and inferior. The camp even had a small theater group that performed German plays and occasionally American ones translated into German. Sports leagues were organized, with different barracks competing against each other in football and volleyball. There was a chess club, a debate society, and a gardening committee that maintained flower beds around the camp. To an outside observer, it might have looked more like a summer camp than a prison facility. Yet Keitel and Jodl could not fully join in this gradual return to normal life. Their rank and their roles in the war separated them from the ordinary soldiers and junior officers who could more easily adapt. Every time Keitel saw a young prisoner laughing at a joke or enjoying a baseball game with American guards, he thought about all the young German soldiers who would never laugh again, who lay buried in mass graves from North Africa to Stalingrad. The guilt grew heavier with each passing day. Keitel stopped eating dessert completely, telling himself he did not deserve the extra sweetness. When Jodl asked him about it, Keitel simply said that every bite of apple pie or chocolate cake reminded him of the millions who had starved under policies he had helped implement. How could he enjoy abundance when so many had died in poverty and hunger? Jodl understood completely. He began giving portions of his own meals to younger prisoners who still looked thin, even though the camp provided adequate food for everyone. It was a symbolic gesture, meaningless in practical terms, but necessary for his conscience. He needed to feel like he was sacrificing something, denying himself something, because the comfort of captivity felt like an insult to all those who had suffered. One evening in late October, as the sun set earlier each day, and the first hints of winter appeared in the cooling air, Keitel and Jodl sat together on a wooden bench outside their barracks. It had become their habit to spend this quiet hour watching the camp settle down for the night. American guards changed shifts with casual professionalism. Prisoners returned from work details in the fields outside the camp. The smell of dinner cooking in the mess hall drifted across the compound. The dinner bell would ring soon, calling them to another generous meal. But for now, they sat in silence, both men lost in their own thoughts. A group of younger prisoners walked past, speaking English with each other, practicing phrases and laughing at their mistakes. One of them called out a greeting to an American guard, who waved back and said something friendly that made the prisoners laugh. Keitel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said that they had lost the war the moment they underestimated America. Not just its military or its factories, but its fundamental character as a nation. They had seen American culture and mistaken kindness for weakness. They had seen American democracy and mistaken debate for division. They had seen American abundance and mistaken generosity for softness. Every assumption had been wrong, and those wrong assumptions had killed millions of people. Jodl nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. He added that a nation with enough surplus to feed its prisoners 3 generous meals every single day, while simultaneously fighting a war across 2 oceans and supplying allies around the world, had possessed reserves of strength that Germany never came close to matching. The ability to be kind even to enemies, to maintain humanitarian standards even during total war, to feed the defeated with abundance rather than revenge. That was real power. That was the kind of strength that could never be defeated by military force alone. They sat in silence for another few minutes. Fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk, their small lights blinking on and off among the trees. The sound of cicadas and crickets filled the evening air. It was peaceful in a way that neither man had experienced in years. The war was over. The fighting had stopped. For the first time since 1939, Europe was not burning. The dinner bell rang across the camp, its clear tone echoing off the buildings. Around them, prisoners began moving toward the mess hall. The smell of roasted meat grew stronger, mixed with the scent of fresh bread and coffee. Another good meal was waiting, better than any banquet they had attended as field marshals of the Third Reich. Better because it was real, not pretense. Better because it came from genuine abundance, not stolen luxury. Better because it represented everything their own nation had failed to provide. Keitel and Jodl stood up slowly, their movements stiff from sitting too long. They looked at each other for a moment, and in that look passed an understanding that needed no words. They had been on the wrong side of history. They had served a regime built on lies and maintained through cruelty. They had believed themselves strong while serving weakness, believed themselves superior while embracing evil, believed themselves destined for greatness while marching toward destruction. They walked slowly toward the mess hall, two old soldiers whose world had ended with Germany's surrender. The building was bright with electric lights, warm and welcoming. Through the windows, they could see prisoners already seated at long tables, talking and eating together. American soldiers served food alongside German prisoners who had volunteered for kitchen duty. Everyone looked well-fed and reasonably content. Keitel paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He thought about writing in his diary later tonight, trying to capture the strange mix of gratitude and shame he felt every evening. How could he explain to future readers that being fed well as a prisoner had destroyed his understanding of power more completely than any battlefield defeat? How could he describe the bitter irony of finding abundance only after embracing total failure? But those were questions for later. Now it was time to eat, to accept the generous meal that would be served, to face once again the uncomfortable truth written in every bite of food. They had fought for promises of strength and received weakness. They had been captured by those they called weak and found strength. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. They entered the mess hall together, joined the line of prisoners waiting for their trays, and prepared themselves for another meal that tasted of defeat wrapped in kindness. Outside, the Mississippi night deepened, full of stars and the sounds of a peaceful land that had never known invasion, never known occupation, never known the desperate hunger that comes when a nation exhausts itself in pointless conquest. The war was over. Germany had lost, and every evening, 3 times a day, the evidence of that loss appeared on metal trays, abundant and undeniable, better than any banquet they had ever known.